On stealth antennas. Promises to be a really interesting topic for all of us, I'm sure, particularly us who live in subdivisions with homeowners associations. So Chip, we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Let me start out by saying this may be one of the most difficult presentations I've put together, because I realized as soon as I started digging into it, I realized the first thing you need to do when you're talking about stealth antennas is ask the person what their situation is. And obviously we've got 30 people here and you've all got different situations. So there is no simple solution to antennas that's going to work for more than two of you, let alone all of you, okay? Antennas are always a series of compromises. I designed and built antennas for Martin Marietta for spacecraft. The number of things you weigh against each other are amazing. And what we found out, we started using evolutionary algorithms where you just let the computer randomly fiddle with things on the antenna and then test it. Worked much better than anything we could do designing. We got some really weird antennas. They work really? First compromise you're looking at is effectiveness. How well does the antenna do what you want it to do? And there's a whole bunch of issues there, and we're going to talk about some of them. I'm probably going to talk less about specific antenna designs than you'd like, than more about sort of generic antenna considerations you need to think about before, along with your situation, before you start building something. We'll talk about bandwidth issues, impedance and SWR issues, and resonance is my big one. Because if an antenna doesn't resonate, it may make a real good load, but it ain't going to do you any good.
Dummy loads don't transmit real well.
Yep. And you can turn any antenna into a dummy load. Transmit will be happy, but it won't do anything. Next big issue is cost. And believe me, you can spend as much on antennas as you want to. And they may or may not work better than one you can put together with $6 worth of copper pipe from Home Depot. Yep. Size and weight, that was a big issue for me at Martin, and it's still something I pay attention to, because I hate climbing up on ladders carrying stuff. I hate even more climbing up my attic carrying stuff. Deployability, issues about how easy it is to get that antenna where you want it and get it set up and performing. Finally, makeability, how easy is it for you to build the thing? And that can vary. Some of them can be really tricky. In general, with antennas, size matters. In general, and again, there's lots of variance on this, but in general, bigger is better, up to certain sizes. You want an antenna to resonate. Generally, the smallest antenna you can make that's going to resonate is about 1/4 of the wavelength that you're working at. There's other ways of approaching that, but in general, for a straight antenna, you need for it to be at least 1/4 wave to be effective. And finally, one of the interesting things I found out is the bigger the cross-section of the conductor you're using, in general, the wider the bandwidth of the antenna. Again, that's not always true, but it's a good rule of thumb. I think about antennas in terms of what is happy. First thing I want happy is my transmitter, because if it's not happy, it burns up, and then I got to buy a new one. And that is all about impedance, which is what determines SWR, and we'll talk about that, and how the transmitter is loaded. Second thing I want happy is the receiver, because if the receiver is not getting enough signal to work, there's not much point in having the radio or the antenna. With stealth antennas, the third consideration we're concerned about is how happy our neighbors and spouse are. And I'm going to talk about some legal issues, not a lot, because my father is an attorney, and I know from experience, you can pay an attorney to absolutely confirm absolutely anything you want them to. Again, happy wallet cost, it's a big issue for all of us. Back, how easy it is to put it in. And finally, operating, because that's really what we're doing this for, is to have an effective radio operating station. And please, if anybody has any questions as I'm going through here, yell at me and we'll do what we can to address them. Transmitters. Most transmitters, modern transmitters, want a 50 ohm load presented to them. They want that load to be basically a resistive load. it's going to be reactive, that it's going to have capacitance and inductance, but if it's tuned properly, it looks like a simple resistive load to the transmitter. That's what makes it happy. What SWR is all about is that transmitters transmitting power down the line to the antenna. In that system, any mismatch, connectors, bends in the cable, wet spots in the cable, the antenna, the valence, anything that changes causes a reflection. And those reflections add up. When they bounce back to the transmitter, the voltages add, the currents add. And it's, since most manufacturers use pretty much all the capacity of the components, the expensive components, the transistors and so on they're putting in that transmitter, if you go over the voltage limits of those transistors, they burn. And it's fairly easy to do that when all those reflected signals start adding up. So most modern transmitters will automatically reduce power when the load's not right, when they're not happy with the load, or they'll burn. And most of us that have been in this game for very long have burned up a transmitter at some point. Right? Again, every transition in a system reflects. And you need to think about that. That's why most of us that have played with RF for very long hate adapters. Because they all reflect, some of them reflect more than antennas. They're scary. Finally, something you need to remember when you're thinking about antennas is the impedance, the complex impedance. The resistive load plus the capacitive and inductive load varies a lot with frequency. And that's something you have to take into account. We'll talk about that. If you're going to, I believe that if you're going to do antennas, you need to be able to measure SWR. If you're going to make your own antennas, if you don't have a way to measure SWR and impedance, you're kind of doomed to failure. Okay, so you're going to need some way to measure SWR, and we'll talk about that a little bit. A lot of modern radios, my 991, my old IC7000, both have really good SWR measuring capabilities. And the IC7000 in particular, one of the reasons I really like it is it'll actually do an SWR plot for you, which is kind of neat. There's not a lot of radios that go that far. Most VHF and UHF radios will show you an SWR measurement. Mostly it's about how happy the radio is with the load it's looking at, and they're not particularly precise or accurate. But for VHF and UHF antennas, they're more than good enough to let you know if you can operate safely. Okay? And I'm going to talk, let me start right now passing around some things you can look at. This is my collection of, part of my collection of impedance and SWR things. These guys are sort of the basic minimum. This one is, I've got two of these. One for, this is an HF sort of frequency range meter, and you can generally pick these guys up for 50 to 70 bucks, and they're very effective. Right? Everybody really should have one. This is a little bit fancier version of kind of the same thing. And the meter's smaller, but it does a little bit more, so I'll pass it around. These are typically around 100 bucks. That one has end connectors, which I actually like better than PL259s. And I've got adapters on it to get to it. So this is one of the newer generation of fairly sophisticated antenna analyzers. I'm impressed as heck with this thing. It goes up to 230 megahertz all the way down through all the HF bands, and it gives you on screen fairly low resolution but very informative plot of complex impedance, SWR, even a Smith chart. And we might ought to think about having a whole meeting doing technical presentation on Smith charts sometimes, because that's really the way to look at RF stuff. I'll turn this on and pass it around. These are, MFJ selling these for about $230 now. And it's, if you're going to do antenna stuff, this is kind of the right way to do it. And finally, just because I wanted to see what these little cheap Chinese guys work like. This is a Mini 60. You can find them on eBay for, as a kit, I think for down to about 50 bucks, and assembled up to $100 or so. This one works to 60 megahertz. It has a USB output, so the computer can do really nice, complex impedance plots, SWR plots, Smith charts. It's a really effective little meter for 60 to 100 bucks. I'm very enthused about these. And I think they do have a version of that that covers at least the VHF band and maybe UHF as well. Okay, so that's a start on passing stuff around for meters. And again, if you're going to build antennas, VHF or HF, or when I say VHF, for this discussion, I mean anything above 50 or 100 megahertz. When I say HF, for this discussion, I mean anything below 50 or 100 megahertz, okay? Okay. And again, some radios have pretty sophisticated SWR and antenna analysis capability. But making your receiver happy. And this also involves some transmission discussion. An antenna is a transducer. Just like a microphone is a transducer between sound pressure waves in the air to an electrical signal in a wire, an antenna is a transducer between photons, which I had the most difficult time. I did laser design stuff in college. Light photons, I sort of have an intuitive grasp of. Photons at RF, I still don't, they just don't make a mental image that makes me happy. But anyway, an antenna is a transducer between electromagnetic waves in space or in the atmosphere and an electromagnetic signal, voltage signal, on a line going to the antenna. So think of your antenna as a transducer, and we want it to be an effective transducer. Resonance and SWR are related, sort of. You can have talk about this, an antenna analyzer can give you a pretty good indication of antenna resonance, and resonance is very directly tied to how well the antenna transduces for both transmitting and receiving signals. It's not 100%, but resonance is a good thing. And the antenna analyzers can give you a really good indication of that. SWR meters, not really so much. Okay? Another good way of checking resonance, especially on a receiver or a radio that has a spectrum display capability, is looking at the noise floor. And with a resonant antenna, especially a fairly narrow band resonant antenna, with a reasonable spectrum display or pan adapter display on your receiver, you can see a dip on the resonance. And that's a really good way of getting a quick estimation of what the resonant characteristics of your antenna are. And again, when you're looking at that spectrum display, if you're wanting to look at the resonance of the antenna, you need to do it without any obvious signals there. You're looking at the noise that's just coming from space. I use my software-defined radios, especially like this guy for it, with a little short antenna and an attenuator connected to my computer. Most of the time I'm transmitting, so I can look at my transmitted signal. And that gives me a really good idea of how much real signal I'm putting out into the world. And that's what we're after all with a transmitter. But I'll pass this around. You can this one's kind of cool. It's not particularly sensitive. You can get these for 40 or 50 bucks on eBay. And it covers from 100 kilohertz to 2 gigahertz. So it gives you a pretty sophisticated receiver spectrum analyzer for 50 or 60 bucks. For SDRs right now, these things are stunning. SDR Play, I gave a presentation on this at our meeting a few months ago, was it, a year ago. This does the same basic thing. They're about 150 bucks I think now. But it gives you a stunning receiver and spectrum analysis capability. Again, at home, I have this plugged into my computer on my ham bench, so that I'm looking at my transmitted signal whenever I transmit. I'm just kind of geeky that way. What can I say? Finally, I just found this thing, I haven't put it together yet. It was $8 from these guys. It's a little field strength indicator, not a field strength meter, it's a field strength indicator. It has an LED. It gets brighter when it senses RF. It's just kind of neat to have it sitting there when I'm in my camper, and when I transmit, it tells me, yeah, something's actually coming out of the antenna out there. So this is, if you're comfortable with through-hole soldering, this is a 10-minute assembly kind of thing. They're about $10. I just couldn't resist. It's cute as hell. But yeah, I'm kind of geeky that way. I actually have an old Radio Shack Citizens Band signal strength meter. It has a little wire antenna with a little coil at the top. And I think I paid $10 for it when I worked at Radio Shack 40 years ago. 50 years ago. Well, that's painful. It actually works pretty darn good, even all through the HF band and even a little bit of VHF. So there's a lot of ways to do that. But again, the whole point of an antenna is either to get as much signal into your receiver as possible, or to do a really good job of getting all your transmitter's power out into electromagnetic fields in the atmosphere. And some kind of signal strength meter is something that's completely external to your radio and antenna system is a really neat way to do that. Okay. I talked about impedance / SWR and resonance being independent. And they mostly are, sort of. But you should think of them as being independent. A really good transducer, like an optimum dipole, is very resonant, a very effective transducer, and is around 300 ohms impedance at the resonant frequencies. That's just the way RF works. Your transmitter wants 50 ohms. So it's not happy transmitting into a dipole. You have to do something to match the two. And most antennas that you get resonant are not going to be resonant at 50 ohms. So you have to do something to get your transmitter happy with it. And it's very possible to do. We use things called valence. Mike did a presentation on valence and units a while ago, and I'm not going to go into it. That's a 2-semester college class. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it now, but don't be afraid of them. First of all, they're fairly easy to make, and there's cookbook things all over the web for making valence and units. A valence goes from a balanced line, like a dipole, or a balanced element, like a dipole or a twin-lead antenna, to an unbalanced element, like coax or a whip antenna. So and depending on how you build the valence, it can convert impedances. So don't be afraid of them. Almost any antenna you put on an HF transmitter, because the transmitter's using coax out, you're going to need a valence for it. A lot of antennas have them built in. You can buy them, you can make them. Unins are from unbalanced to unbalanced. Again, if coax is an unbalanced element, it's what's coming out of your transmitter. If you're going to a whip antenna, vertical whip, this one goes around. This is the whip that I use at my house. It extends to about 28 feet, covers down to 80 meters, quite nice. Do you want to pass? You guys want to pass that around? You want to take a look at it, or do you think it's dangerous? It's got a unin at the bottom. And I've been amazed at this thing. I'll talk more about this as a stealth antenna in a few minutes. But it's very effective. I've worked Japan and Europe on that. Not recently because of the solar cycle we're in. But it's a very effective antenna. And I think, again, eBay, I think I paid $103 for that, which isn't bad. But again, it has a unbalanced matching system network built into that box on the bottom. And just about any HF antenna you use, you're going to need a valence or an unin. Finally, tuners. That's why I brought all this crap in. Tuners are not magic. Any tuner is just a set of variable inductors and capacitors to basically fool the transmitter into thinking it's got a good load so it can put out maximum power and give that signal to the antenna. Problem is, even though it can make the transmitter happy, it doesn't mean the antenna is doing a good job of radiating. Basically, a tuner can turn a big chunk of wire into one of these things. This is a dummy load. The whole point of a dummy load is it doesn't transmit anything, but it makes your transmitter happy. And you can turn any antenna with a tuner into a dummy load. Okay? I don't think we need to pass that around, but if you want to look at it, this is kind of nice. For HF, this is the IC7000 that I use. This is my favorite tuner of all time. It's the MFJ 929. It's an automatic tuner. This is the other tuner from LDG that's available for the IC7000. It's specially made for the 7000. It's a great tuner. It has a red or a green. Well, this one doesn't even have a green LED. I hate things that just have green or red LEDs. There's a bunch of stuff going on in there. The processor in here knows what it's doing. Why can't you tell me? That's what I really like about the 929. It has a really sophisticated measurement capability that shows complex impedance, SWR, capacitance, inductance, how much inductance and capacitance it's switching in, where it's switching in, and you can change it if you want to fiddle with it. And they cost about the same amount of money. I think the 929 is currently about $239, covers all the HF bands, and I'm not going to do a lot of recommending, but if you're looking at tuners, look at that guy. This is a manual tuner, and I've got it because the 991 is a wonderful radio. I'm very pleased with it. Not as happy with the spectrum analysis I'd like to be, but it's a great radio. And it has a built-in auto tuner that works pretty well. It'll tune about a 3-to-1 SWR down to something the transmitter's happy with. 3-to-1 usually isn't enough. So I use the manual tuner to get kind of close and then let the 991 do what it wants to do and it's happy. Again, the 991 and most radios that have built-in auto tuners don't tell you what the hell they're doing. They just tell you what SWR they're seeing after they've tuned it. And I will like that. Anyway. The point there is that, yes, you can measure SWR, see if your transmitter's happy. And it may be transmitting 1,500 watts. Or putting 1,500 watts into the cable at its end. Doesn't mean 1,500 watts is going out the antenna. So resonance is a critical issue to look at as well as SWR. And it's a more complicated issue to look at. Any questions about that? Yeah.
What measures resonance?
An antenna analyzer will measure resonance from the point you have the antenna analyzer connected in. So if you've got a Balun like this, or I'm sorry, an Unan, like this antenna has on its base, it will tell you what it's seeing for the antenna plus the Unan. That doesn't mean that all that signal is getting out into the atmosphere. And a well-designed Unan, it's pretty good. But I've actually, on this antenna, just because I was curious, I went in, disconnected the Unan, connected directly to the antenna, and used the MFJ antenna analyzer on it. And it turned out that the Unan was giving me a pretty good picture of what the system was looking like. If you can connect directly to the antenna, with no tuners, no Unans or Baluns in between your analyzer and the antenna, the analyzer is going to give you a pretty good indication of what the resonance of the antenna is. But most of these analyzers are designed for 50 ohms. A good antenna is very rarely going to be 50 ohms at resonance. That's okay. The analyzer can still give you a nice graph of what the resonance pattern looks like. That doesn't mean the impedance is going to be what you're transmitter wants, but it tells you what the antenna resonates at. And then you can start tuning to get your transmitter happy with it, because the resonance isn't going to change. Okay? The resonance of the antenna structure itself is not going to change. Okay. Sorry I've spent so much time on this, but you really need to think about this stuff before you think about what you're doing with antennas. Come on. Okay. We're going to separate again HF from VHF. When I say HF, I mean below 50 to 100 megahertz. When I say VHF, I mean above 50 to 100 megahertz up to gigahertz. Okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about mobile antennas. How many of people are wanting to hear me talk about stealth HF antennas? Okay, good. How many people want to hear me talk about stealth VHF and UHF antennas? Okay. Generally, and again, stealth means different things depending on context, who you're talking. I'm not going to be talking about how to keep the black helicopters from finding your radio antenna. Okay? For a real simple reason. If the black helicopters are looking for your radio transmitter, they don't need to see your antenna. They got a big loop antenna in there and they can figure out exactly where you are. Okay? For VHF, above 50 megahertz, generally you're not going to be using antenna tuners. Always the case, but we're going to assume that's the case for tonight. You tune the antennas. May clip pieces off of them, loosen the Allen screw, slide the element up and down. A lot of different ways you tune antennas, but you're generally going to do that, something mechanical instead of using an electronic tuner. My experience with mobile antennas is when people talk about stealth antennas for mobile application, what they're really concerned about is not breaking off their antenna like I've done 6 times on my Kia pulling it into the garage. My wife knew how many antennas I've replaced on the Kia. Anyway, so I'm going to talk briefly about mobile VHF antennas for getting into tight spaces, because that's a lot of what people are worried about. And what we have there, these things are cute. It's a little shorty dual band antenna. It works about as well as a rubber ducky on your HT. It's a pretty good load. It makes your transmitter happy. And if you really need an antenna this size, you can get these things on eBay for 10 or 12 bucks. And they're, you know, when you're putting 50 watts into it, on top of my Kia, I can easily hit the Pikes Peak repeater from here on this antenna. Receiving's not quite as good, but you know, if this is what you're trying to get to, it works. I just had to see about these guys. Somebody on eBay was selling them for, I think it was $6. And it's about what they're worth. No, I shouldn't say that. Again, with this on top of my Geo tracker, I can hit the Pikes Peak repeater from here. That ain't bad, you know, for a $6 antenna that I can pull right into the garage with and not do anything with. I'm not going to talk about I didn't bring an example of foldovers. On my Kia now, I have a foldover antenna. So when I pull in the garage, I have to step out, pull it up, fold it down. It goes right in the garage, no problem. And then when I pull out, I slide the sunroof back and reach through and stand it up. Works nicely as long as I remember to do it. What I found is, again, you can get motorized foldover antennas. Pretty cool, but again, forget to push the button, put it down before you go in the garage. That $300 antenna didn't buy anything. They break pretty easily. Another thing, again, I didn't bring the example in. On my Geo tracker, it's short enough that if I put a 2.5-foot dual band antenna on it, it just barely scrapes in the garage door, as long as I adjust the garage door to go all the way up when I pull in the garage. And I found a really neat dual band antenna that the top of it is not soft, but it's a little bit flexible. It's flexible enough that when I pull into the garage, it's fine with it. So if you look around, and I think I got that on eBay for $19.95, and it works really well. So again, if you look around, you can find antennas that let you do that garaging problem without working too hard. One other thing I wanted to pass around because I think it's really cool. for portable use, this is a J-pole. And I've used it when I'm camping and on a 25-watt rig, and it works just about as well as my plumber J-pole over there. And again, you get these on eBay for $6 or $7. They work pretty darn well. Works great with an HT. You can hang it from a tree branch. Okay. Base VHF antennas. These are my favorite. I love this thing. This is my plumber J-pole. You can find instructions for how to make these things all over the net. Anybody remember the old Broomhilda comic strip? There's one classic one my mother had in her office. Broomhilda sitting in the middle of a room with this, she's knitting, and there's this sweater thing like surrounding her that has armholes sticking up and neck holes. And somebody asked her what she's knitting. She says, I don't know, I lost control of it a week ago Tuesday. She's still knitting. That's kind of what happened with these. I started building one day, and I had a bunch of half-inch pipe around, and then I had 6 of them. What I like about this one is I hang it up on a nail in my garage attic, and I don't have to worry about lightning. And on the little 25, I've got 3 of these little QITs. They're really neat little radios, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But with this hanging in my garage, I can do the Pike Speak repeater and check in on the afternoon or the noon weather net just fine. And you can build these for, depending on how much the Chinese are dumping copper for, $3 to $6. And it takes a little bit of soldering expertise, but not much. And you can make J-poles out of damn near anything. There's lots of J-poles on eBay, and they work. The only fiddly thing about this is getting the, looks like it should be a dead short between the center conductor and the shield on the coax, right? And at DC it is. At VHF and UHF, it's 50 ohm load. So they work really well. They're a little bit directional. They're a little bit sensitive about having even wood material close by them, but they work. And I've taken this thing camping, just stuck up in a tree, and it works great for VHF activity. Do you want to pass? We'll try. If anybody gets hurt with this, I just claim all responsibility. Anybody have a steel roof? They're wonderful for VHF antennas. Stick a mag mount on this sucker, put an antenna up there, and work as well as my $200 diamond quad band. Really, it's amazing. And I'm absolutely serious. If you've got a steel roof, stick a mag mount on it. You've got a VHF base station antenna mount that works great. Yeah.
How does that mag mount, how is it affected if it's not on steel, if it's just sitting, say, on a wooden table?
On a wooden table, it's not going to work worth a damn.
Okay.
On a 2-foot cookie pan,
Yeah.
it works pretty darn good. Who remembers the Waldo fire?
Yeah.
I was at Red Cross headquarters operating about 18.7 for 5 days on that until the fire was over and everybody was pretty much done, and the Red Cross started parachuting in millions of people to do something, and we moved to a different location. But from there, from Chapter House down on South Colorado Springs, I don't remember who brought in his VHF portable or mobile, and we literally took a cookie sheet, stuck a mag mount on it, put it in the window, and we operated the entire Waldo fire on that antenna.
Do you have to ground the cookie sheet?
The antenna that I've used in my garage up till I made my plumber's and J-pole was my wife had an old steel roller paint pan. I stuck a magnet mount on that, hung it up in the rafters in my garage. I worked the noon weather chat on that for 4 years.
Steel file cabinets work pretty good.
Yep. There is a relationship between the size of whatever you stick it on and your effectiveness of the antenna that I don't think is critical.
No.
Yeah.
When I first moved down to Monument, didn't have an antenna set up, but I did have a mag mount antenna. So I stuck it to the ductwork in the basement. It was upside down, but people could still understand me.
Yeah, but VHF, it's kind of amazing what you can get away with. So Jake Bull an attic, mag mount on cookie sheet. I'm not kidding, try it. One thing to be aware of with VHF, most mobiles, these two are 50 watts. That little J-pole, the roll-up J-pole thing I passed around, I've used 50 watts into that, it gets warm. Warm's okay, but it worries me. 25 watts, that's why I brought this little guy in. By the way, if anybody needs cheap quad band radios, these little QITs are amazing, they're $100. Quad band, 25 watts, works great. And I'm going to talk about why I have this thing on here in a minute. But I've used that as that roll-up J-pole, works great. Hanging in a tree, works fine. I'm going to talk about legal issues in a few minutes and power issues. You just need to be aware of what you're doing with RF power. And if you put it in the wrong antenna, like some little HT antennas you can get to plug into your HT and stick on the roof of your car, most of those, if you put 10 watts into them, they're okay. If you put 75 or 50 watts into them, maybe not. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about VHF, but it's basically kind of what I've got to say about it. If anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to do what I can to answer. HF is a whole different world for antennas, especially for antennas you're trying to hide. But it's amazing what you can do with a piece of wire hung outside for HF. And it's fairly easy to make those pretty invisible to the neighbors, at least enough so that they generally won't complain about it. That my HF vertical antenna there, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. The advertiser, or the seller, claims that that doesn't need the ground plane or radials. And it really doesn't. But I found that by mounting that on a piece of fence line post, the smaller ones, sticking it down into a corner post, first of all, it elevates it about 10 feet. Secondly, it gives me radials of all the chain link fence. And man, does it work. One of the classic stealth antennas is flagpole antenna. I have used them. If you've got or can put up a metal flagpole, I got one of the Harbor Freight aluminum telescoping flagpoles one time, and set that up with an Unan and a tuner, and it worked. As long as I didn't ground the base of it, figured out a way to isolate the base from ground, it worked pretty well. I had to tune the heck out of it, but I worked most of the US with 100 watts. So. The flagpole stealth antenna, a lot of places where you can't put up an outside antenna, you can get away with flagpole. And you can make a flagpole into a pretty darn good antenna.
And HOAs can't prevent flagpoles.
I'm sorry?
And HOAs can't prevent flagpoles.
HOAs can try to prevent anything they want to. And I'm going to talk about this because it depends on how much they want to pay a lawyer. Because it's a private contract. Okay, finally, for HF stealth antennas, the ultimate is playing around in your attic. Now, if you got a steel roof, you're screwed for a wire antenna in the attic. But if you don't have a steel roof, asphalt, even tile, the neat thing about a long wire antenna is that you can make it resonate with all sorts of weird bends and wrap backs and shapes and coils. You may spend a lot of time trimming it. And that's the one problem with attic antennas is you're going to be up in the attic snipping off an inch at a time trying to get the thing to resonate where you want it to. So it's fiddly, it takes a lot of work. But I'll talk a little bit about antenna shapes. And wire antennas in the attic, I've done some and been amazed with the performance I got. Yep. Legal stuff. And a lot has happened in the last couple of years on legal issues for ham radio operators. Because the government has figured out we're useful. After Katrina, some of the fires here in Colorado, other things, the civil authorities have figured out that ham radio operators are good to have around and on the air. On HOA agreements, people are going to start giggling in a minute when they hit the last bullet item here. HOA agreements are private contracts. And unless somebody is willing to hire a lawyer to do something to you, file against you, they're pretty toothless. Old timers are going to recognize the last bullet. Anyway, and I've been involved in one of these recently. You can get a lawyer for the right fee to write a letter for you that will say that your homeowner association agreements allow or disallow just about anything you want to talk about. What it comes down to is what neighbor is going to make an issue of, and how much are they willing to spend. Because generally, HOAs are not going to spend a lot of money on lawyers. Now, there's a lot of people around that will. Just be, I don't know why. People are like. But, so anyway, that's about all I'm going to say about HOAs, except that the regulation you want to look at is Federal PRB-1. It's pointed to from the ARRL website, and it's a typical federal regulation. It says something about the federal government is preempting the regulation of amateur radio antennas to the extent that regulations must require the minimum practical regulation with reasonable accommodation for radio amateurs. What the hell does that mean? Again, it's one of those things, you can get a lawyer to make that mean just about anything you want. Okay? Doesn't give you a lot of protection, but if you've got an HOA member, a neighbor that's complaining about your wire antenna hanging from a tree, that sounds to me like a pretty reasonable thing for a ham radio operator to do. Print out the 12 pages of PRB-1 and give it to them. Say, you figure out here where it says I can't have that. Okay? I don't know. In Colorado, we're lucky. There's a Senate bill that was signed into law 2 years ago, something like that. Hickenlooper signed it. It was unanimously agreed to by the House and Senate. I think it may be the only such bill in history, if that's the case. Senate Bill 15-0401, which no local government shall enact or enforce an ordinance or resolution regulating, and that includes HOAs, regulating amateur radio antennas that fails to conform with PRB-1's reasonable accommodation provision. So we're going to take all of that sort of nebulous stuff and refer to it one step further away. Good luck. Again, it's one of those things, you print both of those out. And when your neighbor starts complaining about your wire antenna in a tree, hand that to them. Now, my 68-foot tower with a flashing red light on top of it, I can sort of be sensitive to the neighbor complaining about it. But when they made an issue out and they put a cell tower in the lot, I've got a 80-meter Yagi I'm putting on top of that sucker with a flashing red light, and I'm putting it right at their house. 1,500 watts. You should let me have the cell tower. Okay. The Woodmore Gestapo. They're not, Woodmore, I've been here for 40 years, so I have that perspective on things. And the Woodmore Improvement Association, and I'm not in it, I've never been, it's just heard stories about and had to deal with it. It may have been one of the most extreme homeowners association regulation groups I've ever run into. They required you to have shake shingle roofs on a house in Woodmore until Fire Chief Yahtzee in Woodmore said, we're going to stop responding to houses with shake shingle roofs, and they finally modified that part of it. If you're in Woodmore, I don't have a lot of advice for you. Good luck dealing with those people. That's what happens when you get too many retired Air Force colonels on a committee.
It's changing. They're dying.
Oh, the thing, I'm picking on Woodmore because that's what I have experience with. But Woodmore's kind of funny since because they were the upscale community here until 20 years ago. Now we got King's Deer and all the other stuff, and Woodmore is not really that. Anyway, I won't talk any more about that. If anybody has specific questions about it, I'll do what I can to help with it. But if any group in the world should recognize the importance of emergency communications in a fire, for God's sake, it should be Woodmore. Unless it's the Glen and Palmer Lake. Those, not even. Finally, RF exposure. There are very specific FCC regulations about RF exposure. If you're under 100 watts on HF or VHF, probably don't need to be aware of them. If you're going over 100 watts, you really, really, really should read those regulations and understand them, be aware of them, and especially if you're talking about a 10-meter antenna wound up in a room that you're sitting in, or your pregnant wife is sitting in, you really ought to be aware of those regulations and the exposure limits and what they mean. But again, that's a semester class, so I'm not going to talk about it tonight unless somebody's got specific questions. And then we'll take 4 hours after the meeting and review. Again, if you're going over 100 watts, if you're having, that's why I brought this thing in. Is this a really good idea? 25 watts out of a mobile that I'm sitting right next to?
No.
Not for me.
Probably not. On the other hand, if I'm doing it for 10 minutes. On the other hand, for the 4th of July parade, I really seriously thought about putting a belt clip on this radio. Sticking this antenna on my hat, putting my LiPo battery for it in my backpack. But I was carrying 3 radios at parade start, and that's about as geeky as I can make myself go. So anyway, I have used that radio that way. And I haven't done it with the RF meter sitting next to me, and I probably won't because I would just as soon not know. Okay. Finally, we're actually going to talk about some antennas. Maybe if I can get the, there we go. This is my main antenna at the house. You can't see a lot, and that's what I wanted to point out. This is a 160 meter long wire antenna. It's sort of a odd sloping, off-center fed, long wire hung up in tree. Oh, actually, nobody's made me use it, and I'm kind of proud of that. This is what I use to put the antenna inside. This is cool. I can shoot a line about 120 feet in the air with this. Put it right where I want it. Put a weight on the arrow, falls down the other side, and you tie a line on it, pull it back up, and you got a string in the tree. And I kind of brought this so if anybody gave me trouble tonight. But you can get those again on eBay for about, I think they're 15 or 20 bucks. And it's pretty cool. I used the slingshot with a weight on it, and with one hand that's kind of problematic. I hold the pouch in my teeth with
how much weight do you put on the end of that?
very little, because I put on the end of it to go through a tree.
Yeah.
A light fishing weight. Usually, if it goes through the tree, the arrow is enough to pull it down the other side somewhere. And then when I put a string on it, I put weights on that to pull things through. But generally, actually, the arrow's enough because it goes through the tree far enough that I can. And I take that camping with me all the time for my. That's where am I? Now let me talk about this a little bit, and then I'll pass around my head. So I've got this long wire, and you can see it's really not very visible. One of the things that's cool, again, this is a $150 kind of eBay HF antenna. It's an off-center fed. As long as you got a center or off-center support for it, you can put the ends kind of any place. And if you use dark line on it, it's pretty hard to see. And I've used an antenna like this, especially for 160 meter. The long leg of that is 120 feet, something like that. I have strung up that antenna with supports, with a string about halfway out on the long leg tied to another tree, and then the end going to another tree, so it's kind of angles all over the place. It doesn't seem to make a lot of difference in how well it works. It works pretty good. One of the neat things about this antenna is it actually has a balun, for this one, right down here, that reverses the shield and center conductor through the balun. The reason that's useful is it makes this part of the connection, which is coax, into a vertical antenna. Which, coupled with the long wire, makes it kind of tricky to tune, but it gives me vertical and horizontal polarization out of one antenna that's fairly easy to put up and take care of. And it's not, you know, because of the way I've got this mounted, it's obviously pretty visible from the driveway. But if you're a little bit more clever about how you mount it, and I'm back off the road so nobody looks at or cares, and all my neighbors are afraid of me anyway, so they don't say anything. But that's not a terribly objectionable thing to stick up in a yard if you've got some trees around work. And if you get down to like 40 meters or 20 meters, you can use a pretty short set of wire lengths to accomplish that. And again, the reason I like this is I've got this thing so I can get up on this part of the roof and scare my wife and just lay this down on the chimney and fiddle with stuff. But I've got a quad band over 50 megahertz antenna on top of it, and that's the one that I can easily work Cheyenne and Trinidad on a good day, on VHF. And that's what I use that little crossbow thing to get the strings up in the trees. And again, this is an outside antenna. It is visible, but actually I've got a neat slide on it. Instead of just saying it, let me, okay, come on. There we go. This is the telescoping antenna I've got there. Just have a couple of wood wedges and a line pole stuck down into a corner pole with that antenna mounted on top of it. And again, it's not, especially if you've got some trees around, where I've got this out next to my horse pasture, so it's out in the open, kind of obvious, and every once in a while the horses make noises at it. But it's not terribly obvious. It's not really a stealth antenna, but it's generally not objectionable, especially if somebody objects to it and say, well, no, joke's on the next line, so I'll hold it because I want it. This thing's about 25 feet, fully extended, 8 to 10 meters with tuner. It works surprisingly well. It's vertical polarized, which for HF, something you have to think about. It's around $100 on eBay. There's more expensive versions of it. Haven't found a cheaper version of it, but I like that antenna. It works well. And I've worked all the US and Spain on it, so about 100 watts. And I actually had that set up this afternoon in my yard, took it down in about 10 minutes to bring it in. So I've taken it camping a few times. It's a real nice, quick up antenna. Okay, stealth antennas, VHF outdoor. It's easy to make these things invisible. They're generally less than 6 feet for a resonant VHF or UHF antenna. So there's ways to make it less than 6 feet. If your neighbor or your spouse complains about it, tell them, I've just put it up to try out the radio. I'll take it down next week, really. Right? We're talking about the steel roof thing, cookie sheet. 144 and 440 megahertz is easy because they're odd multiples of each other. So if you've got an antenna that tunes to 144, it's generally going to work pretty well at 440. 220 not so much. That's what NSM means to me, not so much. I may have to spell that out so people know what it means. But 220 is not very active anyway, so who cares? J-poles, I love J-poles. Especially the copper J-pole. Polish that thing up, take it in a tray, put another one next to it, tell it's a wind chime. In all these antennas, cabling is critical. For HF, smaller cable generally works pretty well. Put good connectors on it. Mike had a great presentation on that. For VHF, UHF, it's amazing how lossy cable can be. If you're going a long way to a VHF antenna, especially one that's a marginal antenna in the attic or in the garage, it may be worth running big coax to it. So think about that. I'm not going to go into cable tonight because that's another whole semester topic, but cable's important. Generally for HF, smaller cable is acceptable until you get to high powers. For VHF and UHF, thinking about bigger, more expensive cable is well worth the thought.
What do you use?
Sorry?
What do you use?
I use some of both. I've got on the quad band antenna, I've got hardline run to it because I want maximum performance out of that thing. And I was intrigued with the 50 megahertz channels for a while. Turns out there's not enough activity on them to be worth the effort. But so I ran 50 foot of hardline to that quad band antenna I've got on the roof.
What size?
5/8 inch, something like that. And whether it bought me anything, I don't know, but I'm not taking the antenna down to change it. Be very aware that small cable is very lossy, above 50 or 100 megahertz. So think about that. Doesn't mean you can't use it, get away with it. Just be aware that it's lossy. Stealth antennas above 100 megahertz indoor. I really like having a couple of them around because I get lightning hits all the time. And having an antenna that I can leave hooked up and not worry about it is really reassuring. That's why I have that J-pole hung up on a nail in the garage rafters. And it doesn't work as well as my outdoor quad band, but it works well enough. And I don't have to disconnect it all the time. Steel roof. For an indoor attic antenna, you're probably out of luck. That's another one I ought to spell out, because it can mean origin of life. J-pole from the rafters, I love it. I literally had a bunch of copper laying around because I went to plastic pipe in the house and built one of them, and suddenly I had 6 of them. So, anyway. 144, 220's easy, or 440's easy, 220 not so much. Directionals. I have a 6-element Yagi in my attic, my garage attic, and I use it to work Woodland Park from my house on top of 105 to the east where it tops out. It took some tuning, it took some aiming. It's kind of neat to be able to hit Woodland Park and Cripple Creek with the mountains in the way. Try it with J-pole, directionals, any VHF antenna, UHF antenna, even wood. The farther you can keep it away from it, it makes a significant difference. That J-pole, I hang it from, the top of it really doesn't do much, so I hang that from the nail right at the peak of the truss, so that it's a fair distance away from any other material, even wood material, and that makes a significant difference in how well it performs. I've got another version of that antenna. If you pick that up for just a second, on the longer leg of it, instead of putting the little loop at the top, I put a T in for the longer leg of it, because it turns out if you leave a 1.5 foot pipe sticking out of the bottom of the longer leg, it has absolutely no effect on its radiation performance. And I tied that to a rafter in the garage. Works great.
Is your Yagi in the attic on a rotating mount?
No,
Or do you- is it
there's nothing east
one
of here I'm trying to
direction,
hit. I've got it
except for one
pointed
direction?
straight at Woodland Park, yeah.
Okay.
I stuck that up one afternoon, it was stormy, and I wanted to see, I've used it outside at Woodland Park and Cripple Creek, and I got a really good performance from it. I thought, oh, I wonder if I just stuck this up in the garage if it would work. And it does.
Is it VHF or UHF?
It's actually, I got it at the MegaFest over here a few years ago. It's about a $500, 150 megahertz commercial Yagi. for police and fire operation. And I trimmed it down to be resonant at 144 megahertz. And then it turns out it's reasonably resonant at part of 442. I think I paid $8 for it. I waited till 1 o'clock and the old guy that was selling it really didn't want to put it back in his car. So anyway, think about hiding stuff. It's absolutely true that the bigger an antenna is, generally the better it is. The longer the wire for HF stuff, the better it is. But you can contort that wire in some really strange shapes. And it's probably going to not resonate at the same length as it would if it was stretched out. But generally on an HF antenna, you're going to be out there trimming ends off of it to get it to resonate anyway. So don't be afraid of putting turns and corners and doing whatever you have to do to get it figured out, or the trees you have available, or whatever. A bent resonant wire is much better than a short not resonant wire. So again, don't be afraid to bend wire antennas. Again, if you stick up an antenna and the neighbor complains about it, or your spouse does, I just want to try out the radio. I'll take it down next week. They'll forget about it, and 2 years later, they'll be replacing it because the insulation's worn off. Tuners. For HF, you are going to use tuners. Just get used to the fact. And again, there's a lot of tuners around. Anymore, generally, if you get, first of all, a lot of modern HF radios have antenna tuners built in. And they work over a fairly narrow range of SWR. Generally a narrower range than you're actually going to experience. So you're probably going to need you're going to need to do something with the antenna to get it to the point where your automatic tuner in the radio will work. I use this big manual tuner, and it lets me adjust the antenna, so then the tuner in the radio works fine, and that works. The neat thing about the automatic tuners, this radio has a button here that talks to the tuner, so when I get to a frequency, I push that button, the tuner goes click, tells me exactly what impedance it's tuned to, what SWR it's measuring, what the frequency is, and everything else, and it's 1 to 1.1 or 1.2 SWR. Now, does that mean that all that 100 watts I'm sitting on my transmitter is going out the antenna? No, it doesn't. But it means the transmitter's putting out the maximum power it can. And if I've done a good job of building the antenna in the first place, I'm probably getting a pretty good transfer of energy out of the antenna. Vertical versus horizontal in both HF and VHF. You need to think about polarization. And you know, everybody told me when I was starting in HF that you've got to have horizontally wire antennas because everything that anybody's doing is wire antennas and horizontally polarized. And I've got a really nice horizontally polarized wire antenna. And I usually can work more stuff on the vertical than I can on the wire antenna. So for HF, polarization is important. You need to think about it, but stick up an antenna and see how it works, and then worry about it.
When you, once you start on HF, once you start doing the bouncing, doesn't your polarization kind of like out?
It does all sorts of weird stuff, absolutely. So, yeah, the whole point of HF generally is to get ionospheric bending and refraction, and so you're transmitting over the horizon and talking over the horizon, and you're absolutely right. The polarization becomes weird when you start bouncing signals around. Again, for HF, small cable is generally not too lossy, which gives you a lot of flexibility because you can get small cables through heating ducts in the ceiling and whatever. I have used, any horse people? Okay. I have lots of different electric fence stuff laying around. I take half-inch tape camping. I have 2-inch electric fence tape around my arena because I've got a horse that listens to see if the electric fence is on, and if it's not, she ends up. It's fast. I've got the little round electric fence. I've used that as a long wire antenna. The 2-inch tape actually works pretty darn well, but the conductors in it are stainless steel. And stainless steel in general is not a really good conductor. I discourage you, if you try to use steel for an antenna, a radiating element, you're probably going to be disappointed. Copper and aluminum work great. Mike, do you have any comments on that? Because that's a...
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of the antenna. If you have a really long run of steel, yeah, it's gonna be lossy.
Yeah.
But, it depends on the amount of loss.
Yeah. And again, I've used a barbed wire length for a long wire HF antenna, and this 929 tuned the damn thing, and I talked to Mexico. You know? Be very careful you've turned off the electric fence charger before you hook up your $2,000 HF receiver to the chunk of electric fence.
Lightning arrestor doesn't take care of that?
I'd rather not find out. Okay, again, if you've got a big HF multi-element antenna on a 60-foot tower, you're begging for lightning strikes, especially here. An indoor HF antenna, and I've got a couple of little HF antennas that I play with, they're not real effective, they're not real efficient, but I don't have to worry about them during lightning storms. So I use them occasionally. A bit resonant wire with no tuner is an infinitely better antenna than a tuned short wire antenna that your transmitter thinks is a really good load, but doesn't resonate very well. And I put some diagrams down here. I have seen some weird shapes work, and there's lots of articles on the internet. If you're interested in doing wire antennas in the attic, it's a semester class. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time about it because it depends on your attic, and you're going to spend time up there snipping things and finding different places. You're going to fiddle with it, but they can be very effective. Hanging elements like this, with this going to the transmitter. Sorry, I never know quite where this thumb is. I got a fake thumb. My horse crushed one of my thumbs, my only thumb. And this is my second left toe, and it's never quite in place. Anyway, bent antennas work great. I've used slopers, that's why I want to pass this thing around. This thing is cool. Got it on eBay, I think it was 40 bucks. It's length of coax, and then a folded back element, and an element that goes out the little loop. And I pull that up into a tree, and I've got a long sloper with the counterpoise tied back along the main line. And I've worked camping, set this thing up in 10 minutes, 100 watts. I've worked all over the country with it. Lead antenna. It's not as good as some other antennas, but for home use, if you need to get an antenna, you want to try an antenna for HF. See what you can accomplish. You can get one of these things for 30, 40 bucks. Wind it around the trees or your attic and see what happens. That's kind of what I was pointing out with this. Loops. You can do weird things with loops in a room. I've seen people tack antennas, loops around the ceiling in their second bedroom in the apartment and work most of the country that way. You're going to have to tune it, and you're going to fiddle with it. But it can be pretty darn effective, especially when it's not something we take advantage of here, but if you're in a high-rise apartment in Miami with the ocean next door, you can work the whole world that way. I know people that do it. I haven't done it myself, but I know people that have strung up lengths of wire to build a directional 20-meter antenna in their attic. And it worked beautiful. I was stunned at how well it worked. So, again, get creative, get inventive. A lot of things you can do. Finally, have I gone way over? Or we?
We're getting close, but
Okay.
if you can wrap it up.
Be creative. You can make damn near anything radiate. I have seen people tie a piece of coax onto a steel downspout and on 100 watts work most of the country.
I've heard stories about a guy that hooked up a floor lamp.
Yep.
And the light bulbs would flash while he was changing.
That's what we used to use for dummy load. You remember using light bulbs for a dummy load with your heat kit? I did that. Don't do it with an LED light bulb. It won't be that. And it doesn't make much of a load.
Do that in service.
As far as dealing with your neighbors, I don't know about your spouse, that's your problem. With my neighbors, I'm gonna stick it up there, and if they come yell at me, oh, gee, I'm sorry. I move it over closer to the house, is that okay? As I said, most of my neighbors are kind of afraid of me, so anyway. Especially for HF, you are gonna have to get to know tuners. If you wanna do HF, you're gonna deal with tuners. Don't be afraid of them, and it's a little pricier than some of the others, but this MFJ 929, I've actually got another one I use with my 857, and it's a great tool. Bale and Zunes, again. If you're gonna do HF stuff, you're gonna be dealing with Bale and Zunes. And there's a lot of good articles on the net, so don't be afraid of them. You can get, one thing I do wanna mention, if you make your own Balens and Unans, you're gonna be dealing with big ferrite cores. It's not a problem, except that most of the ones you find on eBay, they are very frequency tuned. And most of the ones, the nice, the beautiful 2-inch ferrite cores you find on eBay are designed for switching power supplies. They don't deal well with frequencies above about 100 kilohertz. You're not even working much HF with that. So look at this, if you start doing these things, look at the specs for the ferrite. It makes a difference.
Yeah, good company, a good company to look at, and it's real easy to remember their name too, because it's a rather novel name, is Fairrite, F-A-I-R-R-I-T-E. And they make good RF and microwave capable ferrites.
Yep.
With relatively low loss. The big issue with ferrites is they can be very lossy. And in some cases, you want ferrites to be lossy because that's what gives you common mode suppression.
Yeah, just be aware, because it's real tempting. You go on eBay looking for ferrite, and you see these beautiful ferrite cores, and they're gorgeous. They're $6, and they're probably not going to do what you need them to do. Okay. Meters. If all you're going to do is VHF and UHF, you still probably should have an SWR meter. But if you're going to do HF stuff, you really need to get an SWR meter or an antenna analyzer. And there's probably enough of them around in the club that if you approach people, you can borrow one to try one out. And there's hundreds of them around. Chinese and Japanese radio operators have gotten into making the things, and they're doing some kind of cool stuff that's pretty cheap. So anyway, cables are a big deal. Remember, above 100 megahertz, bigger cables, better. Cable gets lossy. eBay, there's a lot of amazingly good stuff on eBay pretty cheap. There's some real garbage there too, so be aware of that. Say no. Finally, there is lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of stuff online for building, designing, homebrewing antennas. Homebrewing used to be, to a large extent, what ham radio was all about. I was blessed to grow up 2 blocks from the Heathkit store in Kansas City during the heyday of Heathkit. I was there all the time drooling. And that's what ham radio used to be about, was building radios. You really don't much do that anymore. But there's still plenty of opportunity for homebrewing stuff with antennas.
Radio Shack used to sell radios.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Big deal.
managed a Radio Shack for a couple of years while I was going to school. It was an interesting time. I was there when they introduced the TRS-80. The manager of the store before me was smarter than me. He remortgaged his house, borrowed every penny he could from every relative he could get to talk to him, and bought Radio Shack stock a month before the TRS-80 was introduced. He retired the next year.
Wow.
I've got great stories about Radio Shack. I miss Radio Shack. Anyway, that's pretty much all I've got. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be happy to do what I can with them. Our next presentation again is Stu talking about the Foxheim thing. I did a presentation at the Tech Field Day on programming radios, specifically kind of built around the Chirp software engine. Is there enough interest in not doing that presentation, but actually having a night where people could bring in their notebook computers or desktops if you want to, and radios, and we'll try to get you set up to program stuff? How many people would be interested in doing that? Okay, that's kind of what I want to get a feel for. Good. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chip. That was a really interesting presentation. I just want to make a quick comment about antenna loss that Chip touched on, but it's an important concept. When you send a wave down your cable to drive your antenna, the power goes into two specific things. Part of it goes down and bounces off the load, so one portion of it actually goes into the antenna, but that doesn't mean that it gets radiated. Antennas have what's called radiation resistance, and if the loss is much bigger than the radiation resistance, then most of the power goes into heat, and very little gets emitted. And so, as Chip was alluding to, with small antennas, what happens is that the loss in the antenna swamps out the radiation resistance, and most of your power goes into loss, even though it's absorbed in the antenna. The other portion of the power is what bounces off the load and comes back, and that just really gets absorbed back in your radio, in its back termination. So if you think about how much power is being transmitted, there's two components. One is how much actually gets to the antenna, and then of that power that gets in the antenna, how much actually gets radiated through its internal radiation resistance versus how much gets converted into heat. And when you have a good, well-tuned resonant, when he talks about resonance, what that means is that radiation resistance gets big compared to the degree of loss. And if you use a small cable, the amount of loss increases. And so these are some of the trade-offs with antennas, but it's a good thing to keep in mind, those two separate components of where your power is going. Anyway, that was a great presentation, Chip. Really some great ideas for hiding antennas. I like the tell them it's temporary approach. Anyway, I think that concludes our meeting for tonight. We appreciate you all coming, especially the new people who are here, and we'll be looking forward to next month's meeting.
I think a few people may not have signed the roster. If you wouldn't mind and you didn't, would you please do that before you leave?
Sure. Thanks, John. Anyway, I think we're adjourned unless anyone has any other comments.